like we're pretty close to being set, Eli.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. So my first question is simply, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease, and your work focuses on type 1. Just explain briefly for the audience the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes.
Sure. First of all, thanks for anybody who's listening to this. It's a good question because people sometimes confuse the two. Type 1 diabetes is where usually these are youngsters. The immune system does attack the pancreas very specifically. And when that happens, the pancreas loses function, which was intended to release insulin to the blood and take control of sugar. In type 2 diabetes, the more proper name would be insulin resistance. It typically does happen later in life, and it has no specific immune-related process. It's mostly inflammation, obesity, long-standing poor lifestyle, and poor habits. And when that happens, actually sugar also rises. And so the majority of my work does have to do with the immune system. Therefore, it's mostly type 1 diabetes.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So Eli, you discovered that a natural compound, a protein actually, that's found in our bodies and produced in the liver that we refer to as alpha-1,
Right.
also known as A1AT, helps to combat all kinds of diseases. And you've seen and had success with it dealing with emphysema. You found that it works with type 1 diabetes. So just explain alpha-1 and your research.
Sure. So you can find a lot of this on the internet if anybody's watching and wants to catch up. You just type alpha-1 antitrypsin and it will start showing the literature. Basically, this is a protein that we all have in our blood. And it's a protein that's intended to improve the repair of tissues. And actually, it's very primitive. It's very old in the evolution of animals. And anyone who has the flu or is sick will have those levels of that alpha-1 and some other proteins rise in the blood for a period of time. And we're now realizing that this molecule is protective intentionally. The good thing is that we can actually extract it from blood and give it to people. And the history has that alpha-1 has been missing from some people. So for those people, pretty straightforward. We just introduced alpha-1. Don't tell me the rockets reached New York.
No. I'm in New York, but the lights have gone out. But the lights are working in Beersheba, Israel. So we're in good shape.
Yeah, all the time. There you go. So yeah, well, I was saying that it's a natural protein that the body releases when we're sick to protect the tissues, and we have it in our hands. The history of alpha-1 is actually different a bit because it was administered to people who have less alpha-1. People with genetic deficiency, they have usually emphysema, which is the breakdown of the lungs. So for these individuals, they've been extracting alpha-1 from blood products so that they can give them. And we have a very nice safety record for several decades for a very large range of ages.
Now, your research has shown most success with people early,
Right.
In very early stage diabetes type 1. Can you explain why that is, what the results have been? And also, if you're older and you've had diabetes for some time, is your research generating a path for hope or not yet?
Yeah, definitely yes. So the answer is, it might be a bit surprising, but the study started not to do with diabetes. The study actually started with anything to do with the immune system that's unwanted. And it started with transplants. And we had the feeling that when you transplant an organ or any other cell or tissue, the condition of that organ may actually translate to a worse rejection. And we started to look at alpha-1 as something that addresses tissue well-being. If the tissue is in a better state, like with alpha-1, then maybe the immune system would be less aggressive in a transplant. And the first experiments were to transplant pieces of pancreas for diabetes first in animals, but it actually is also part of studies that are ongoing since year 2000 in people, individuals with type 1. So that axis is very attractive, but at some point we said, well, if the immune system is attacking them anyway, the pancreas is being attacked early in the disease, that's exactly where we think alpha-1 has the best benefit. So we actually started to look at youngsters with type 1 diabetes that were recently diagnosed. And because they were recently diagnosed, we assumed that they still have an immune response. And when you add alpha-1 to these individuals, we did see very nice improvements. 3 clinical trials by now, the first one in Colorado with my colleagues, impressive group of people there. Professor Charles Dinarello, one of the heads of this research. And we moved on, and now we just published this recent clinical trial, which had more than 100 individuals with type 1 diabetes getting treated with alpha-1. That said, there's a choice, there's a rationale when you go to clinical trial, and you have to be very logical about what you choose, when you choose. So it's very typical for type 1 diabetes clinical trials to choose the early stage when things appear to be more dynamic and you may actually maneuver them a bit. We have very little evidence.
Does that mean if somebody's not early stage that there's no opportunity to be a part of the trial?
Never say no. Remember, the lights went on at some point. Don't say no. Because the disease actually takes on very individual differences between people. What we think by now, scientifically, is that if there's an immune attack ongoing at any point, maybe it's even later, and there's a residual pancreatic mass that's being injured and assaulted and could benefit, then definitely that would be a point that I would consider with alpha-1. But again, with clinical trials, you have to be more strict with inclusion criteria and very narrow. We had quite a few off-label experiences where physicians rightfully prescribed alpha-1 because it's on the shelf just for another indication, and they prescribe it. And in some of the cases, we see success also in some people that were longer down the road. That said, I would think that if somebody has diabetes type 1 far down with no residual pancreatic mass, I would direct them towards transplants, and there alpha-1 is now breaking ground as well. And again, that's where the transplant benefits from alpha-1. So there's such a thing as pancreatic islet transplants.
So there was recently some coverage of about new discovery in Israel that's a bioartificial pancreas. That isn't really your work, but can you describe the promise of that research and how it relates to what you do?
Yeah, so first of all, maybe you don't even know this, Doug, the chief of this development was actually my teacher here at BGU. So it's a circle. Clap your hands again. No. Yeah, so he taught us here at BGU when we were medical students in the beginning, endocrinology, and then he
I'm going to get the lights to turn back on.
If you move a bit, maybe. Yeah. I thought it was daytime.
I know. How about that?
Okay. So Professor Philip, that's the head of this innovation. The idea is that today people with diabetes, type 1, but also type 2, measure glucose by pricking the fingers or by continuous meter that's connected to their blood supply. And they inject insulin by a syringe. And this artificial pancreas, the concept is that if we have a needle to supply insulin and a needle to measure glucose, we can actually add in between them a chip that will calculate how much insulin to give every moment. That's called the artificial pancreas. And it's a bit more elaborate than that, but in general, that would mean hands off, and you can just have the meter and the insulin injections being coordinated without your intervention, which is very attractive.
External to the body, like a pump
Completely.
system and what they call the CGM, the continuous glucose monitors that are available today. And this would be an interface, but not something surgically implanted.
No, it's not surgical. I actually joke with medical students that I keep telling them, go find me the pictures of the pancreatic, like this artificial pancreas, and they think it's going to be this big metal pancreas. And no, they come back and they say it's just a computer algorithm. But yeah, that's going to be a very attractive thing, and it's showing very nice promise. And I could just give you a bit of my philosophy. There's no competition here. I'd rather have many things work with type 1, and I already told you that type 1 has different forms. So this is actually very good. How do you say, when you walk and there's like this rail that you can hold on to? It's a very good thing to have. It doesn't fix the condition. Your body will have that condition, but it does allow life to go a little less, with a little less distraction.
And more reliable control of your blood sugar levels, etc.
Yeah, pretty much more reliable. And also consider sometimes kids with type 1 diabetes, you know what? They're actually in a much better state of mind than their parents, which are frantic, and they let the kids go to school with a syringe of insulin. So it adds a lot to the circle, which is also psychological, social, not just the actual pancreas, but also the circle of family that's involved could live a much better, peaceful life. Yeah.
So a quick message for the audience. I can see that we have over 70 participants from the United States, Israel, and Canada. And for those of you who would like to ask questions of Eli, you click on the Q&A button and your question will come up, and I'll be able to read through the questions and then direct them to Eli. So I have one here, actually.
Okay.
I have, it's from an anonymous attendee that has adult onset type 1. They were misdiagnosed by several prominent endocrinologists. I'm sorry about that, as type 2 before being correctly diagnosed at age over 50. Can this person be a candidate for your trials? And if so, how do they go about becoming a member?
Okay, so anonymous, the new friend of BGU. It's a very common question. So you actually represent quite a few people. Whether or not you can get alpha-1 has basically nothing to do with a clinical trial. Every physician can actually prescribe it, but clinical trials are planned according to a hypothesis, a question, and then they're very strict about the age, the time from diagnosis. So that's the technical part of it. If you find your physician, they can look it up and they can consider. As the researcher behind the consortium around alpha-1, I would say that there's no harm in giving alpha-1. Our bodies generate it anyway. We need more at times. And also 100% of patients with type 1 diabetes have their alpha-1 knocked down by sugar. And a Swedish study has shown that 50%, 50, of type 2 diabetics have their alpha-1 inactivated by sugar. So by having diabetes which might be poorly controlled and glucose might be high, either kind of diabetes, it looks like alpha-1 in your blood might be inactivated. So giving more may actually compensate for that. I cannot promise the outcomes, but I do know that there's no side effects for thousands of individuals in clinical trials. So that's a good thing to know, at least.
So you're, Eli, thank you for joining us all the way from Israel. This webinar is obviously of importance to people because from the participants, I'm starting to get loaded with questions. So I'm going to just do my best to work through some of these.
Okay.
We have another question about a trial. This particular person says their 16-year-old son was just diagnosed last month. Are there current trials that her son could participate in?
Okay, that's a very good point, and I want to send the parents all my support as much as I can. You're going to be okay. So there's no clinical trial running now that's recruiting, but if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is the United States clinical trial database.
Clinicaltrials.gov.
Exactly, one word, .gov. and punch in the keywords. You can type in diabetes and anything else you want to type as keyword. You'll pull up all the clinical trials that are running, ongoing, in green, and those that are finished in red. And it's a really good source to look at. At present, the clinical trials for alpha-1 have been completed, and there's a design for new clinical trials. But again, I have to emphasize, if you find a physician, either an endocrinologist or pulmonologist or pediatric, that read up on the material, especially the new release from the Israeli study, they will be convinced enough to prescribe it. But a clinical trial at present is not running.
Okay, so I've got another question that's along the lines of what you were just saying.
Okay.
This person's asking it, do they just ask their endocrinologist to prescribe alpha-1?
Okay, that's a good point. How funny can I be on the webinar live? Well, it depends on the endocrinologist age. The more restrained, orthodox, conserved physicians will say, well, diabetes has been here for so long and we have nothing to give for it. And they're a bit more skeptical, and we actually proved some of them very wrong. The younger ones will say, well, you know what, I'm at this point in modern medicine, this is a refreshing idea because you're giving the body something that it has, but not enough, maybe not for long enough, or maybe it's inactivated. And we see there a very nice compliance. The younger physicians will say, you know what, I see no harm. My oath has it that I will do no harm and I'll find a way to give something. Regulatory wise, it's completely possible, and you have a set of signatures, but just give them the information from the internet, just give them all the latest literature, and they should read up and decide.
We're getting some questions on how alpha-1 is actually administered. What form does it come in? What's the appropriate dosage?
So, oh wow, a few more details and I can go home. So basically, at present, it's given by an IV drip, intravenous drip. This we just borrow the protocol from the individuals that get alpha-1 for their lungs for emphysema, which is on label. That's being prescribed at the present for 1 in 5,000 people. They're diagnosed with a genetic deficiency in alpha-1. They get it IV in a slow drip. Once a week, they visit the infusion center, and it goes by weight. So if somebody is bigger, it will take longer, maybe an hour. And younger kids will get it in half an hour. They just watch video games. God forbid they should read something. But it's a very short drip, and they go back home, and after a week they come back again. In the trials that we ran in Israel at present, we've extended, and for the better, the number of infusions. But just consider that the other people that have this for the lungs take it for life. So this is what we have at present, a slow drip. We're working on different kinds of administration. Nobody wants to go for once a week to get a small injection, but that's the one that we know that's safe and that's been running for 3 decades. Yeah, and the doses are in the literature as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's
Sure.
talk a little bit about being the co-chair of BGU's Wound Healing Hub.
Thanks, I almost forgot about that.
Yeah, what is a wound healing hub, and how does your research with alpha-1 relate to your work in that hub?
Sure, well, that's a very good point that you raised, because if you consider alpha-1 in the blood being one of those molecules that allows tissues to repair, it almost goes without saying that a wound will benefit. And so before we established the Wound Healing Hub, which is a consortium of a few tens of doctors, physicians, nurses, PhDs, social workers that all have to do with wounds.
And people with diabetes are slow wound healers generally.
Yeah, slow at best. Slow at best. There's so many reasons for that. What the Wound Healing Hub would do, we have meetings, workshops, conferences, brainstorming sessions about conditions with wounds that poorly heal. We had a couple of these events to do with diabetes, and it was very interesting, particularly because we mix in these meetings nurses, social workers, family members of individuals with diabetes and other conditions. And you can see that there's a lot more to the disease and the wounds than just the glucose levels. So the Wound Healing Hub deals with wounds of all sorts, including diabetes. And Alpha-1 is one of the leading studies that we're running with that. I'll give you a bit of information to see how bigger it is than just diabetes. Patients who get chemotherapy have problems closing wounds. Patients who get immunosuppression, like a transplant, they will have problems closing wounds. Patients who have irradiation for conditions that require it, that area will have very hard time closing. And we're looking for things to help the wounds close. So that's the Wound Healing Hub at BGU.
Is there a topical cream or something that is accessible that people can get?
Yeah, I'm tempted to almost pull out one of the experimental creams, but we're now developing several forms. So there's a spray, there's going to be a gel, a cream of different sorts. The idea that we can give it topically, or if people don't know about this, just on the surface of the skin, is very attractive. Very attractive. We already have publications of wounds closing faster with Alpha-1, just being dripped on the wounds. There's a study that we're looking for funds for to kick off with atopic dermatitis. These are kids that have this horrible rash, and we want to put some Alpha-1 on their wounds. These are always expensive. But you can see that when it comes to healing a wound or a tissue, the diseases don't separate like we separate them in the index of a medical book. They all have this common problem to close, fix, repair the tissue. And we may have actually found this common uniform, one of the molecules that can actually address that and help a tissue heal in different diseases.
You mentioned the consortium of researchers.
Yeah.
So how unique is the work that you're doing at BGU relative to work being done elsewhere in Israel or in the States?
In the States and in Europe and Australia and Canada. You know, it takes a village. I mean, much bigger than a village. What we do to set us aside from the rest, we actually break down Alpha-1 to see how it works. And I'm doing a lot of things with my hand, but it's outside the frame. We break it down. It looks like a Swiss Army knife that has like scissors and a knife. It has a lot of functions. It survived evolution and kept all the positive attributes. And we're now starting to understand in my lab with our team here at the Faculty of Health Sciences, what parts of the structure do what's their actual function. And while we were doing this, we started to notice that the human Alpha-1 is somewhat eroded compared to the animals, to the older forms of Alpha-1. Every creature has some form of Alpha-1. If you compare ours to a salamandra, it's hard to even compare them. They've been ours has been so much eroded. And now we're actually developing all sorts of Alpha-1 that have regained function or enhanced functions so that we can give a lot less and maybe it could sustain longer and have a much bigger impact. So this breakdown of the structure to understand what it does is unique to our lab.
If you needed help in a particular area, you know, where do you need more support? Equipment, additional researchers, what do you need?
Okay, that's a question. I'll give you the answer that covers all of it. And that is that everything that comes in is fuel for this journey. Everything from just yesterday, I got a donation of $18, like in Hebrew, it's high dollars for Hanukkah. And you know what? It pushes it a bit further. Instruments would cost more than $100,000, and every one of those instruments pushes our research further tenfold in many ways. The global community of academics requires a lot of these high-end instruments and procedures and methods and critical analysis, and we're doing our best, but everything like that can really help. Funding for students, funding for reagents, particular project I can share later on if there's a web page for this to follow. Particular projects have to do, for example, with cochlear implants to the ear. We're trying to develop a coating with Alpha-1 to have those better work because when they go in, they actually break the tissue. That's a specific one for which we need an instrument that costs $30,000 to work with. There's a lot of other projects. If you can think of a wound, we're there trying to build up this momentum. So any incoming funds is always good. The academic funding is there, but it's very project oriented for academic results. If I were one of the listeners, if I'm part of the community of people that want this to work because they need it in their life, then that's where they should go. This is where the momentum can come from. And the need
so
is
if
very
you're a
big.
participant and our participant number keeps growing, so you're doing a great job, Eli. Thank you for
I don't know, I'm
joining
shouting
us.
here from my side.
You can find out more information on our website. You can go to aabgu.org. If you want to email me with questions or some follow-up, or you would be interested in supporting the work, you can email me at doug@aabgu.org. Eli, our time is wrapping up.
Okay.
We didn't talk, your research is focused on type 1. If somebody's participating and they have type 2, is there hope for them also with the alpha 1? And then also just give some closing comments.
Sure, thanks. So with type 2 diabetes, we're lagging in research because it's not an immune condition. We do see a lot of overlap in the benefits that we're looking for. Type 2 diabetes being so different has a lot of things that I think it's only responsible from my end to tell you that it's a lot more to do with lifestyle and your choices. Added to that, if glucose is poorly controlled, we would like to help it with alpha-1 because just having an inflammatory background, a chronic inflammatory background, is already something that you can maybe push away with alpha-1. And your tissues suffer from type 2 diabetes. Tissues that suffer benefit from alpha-1. So there are beginnings of work there for particularly tissue damage. There's neurotoxicity, there's blindness, there's other issues that come with sugar being chronically high that we're now starting to see that alpha-1 can protect these from these side effects. I would say that in closing, in general, everyone has the right to know the answers to their questions. Seriously, everyone, don't hesitate. I'm glad Doug gave you the email because now you can feel how it is. And just ask. You deserve these answers, and the research is literally done for your sakes. And any way that can support research is valid. It just means that this is important to you, and I think it is.
Thank you very much. I mean,
Sure.
You were voted by the student union as one of the most inspirational lecturers, and I think this was really an inspirational talk. It's a tough disease. I know in my own family, people suffer from it, and it's something daily that you try to manage as best as you can.
Completely.
And there sounds like there's real hope for people who are young with the alpha-1, and that there's also hope for people that have had the disease for some time. So
Yes.
stay tuned to the research, and we'll do everything that we can to communicate. So again, for the participants, thank you all for joining us. And for more information, you can go to our website, as I mentioned before, www.aabgu.org, and we'll follow up. There will also be a replay of this webinar live from Israel. When you replay it, it won't be live, but we will do a replay and send out links so that you can share it with other friends and family. Thank you so much for joining us, and almost Laila Tov in Israel.
Thanks.
Thank you, Eli.
Good night. I mean, good morning, whatever.
Take care.
Ciao.